chairman of the Elizabeth Van Moore Foundation and vice chairman of the Pupil House Board and some other things. But tonight, I want Kevin Cherry just to come up here a second. I know he hates that. While he's coming up here, 1918, when those brave people fought off all those folks coming out to get our stuff in the Pupil House and saved it and started the preservation movement. That was one of the greatest achievements that's ever happened in Eatonton. And I think the other greatest achievement in Eatonton was the transfer of Hayes to the Elizabeth Van Moore Foundation. And this man was at that point the head of Archives and History. He ran all the museums, all the preservation budget, everything to do with preservation in the state of North Carolina. He was in charge of that. And he sat down and on one napkin, I mean, my job was to not have an empty house, raise the money for the furnishings. Kevin's was to find $6.3 million. And we sat down and on a napkin, he designed a program, really a plan that we were able to execute flawlessly. And the result was, in the last day of 2022, Hayes transferred to the state of North Carolina with 200 acres. And after that, it was transferred over with a 50-year lease to the Elizabeth Van Moore Foundation. So Eatonton owes this man a great debt of gratitude, and he never takes credit. He works for the Generette Foundation now. I want everybody to give him a stand ovation.
Everybody who did any little bit of it. Hayes is one of the great treasures of not only this state, but this country. And a lot of the reason to say this is
Thank you. I think everyone can hear me better this way. So we are very happy to have all of you here for our third in our speaker series. Today we are celebrating having Susan Buck return to Eatonton. She was here back in 2018 doing some analysis on the Cupola House, and she was able to bring our Cupola House back to its original colors on the second floor and on the outside. And you can see how beautiful it is now. So we are so fortunate to have her being able to do additional paint analysis now on the first floor, now that we have the woodwork back. And we're going to find out some of her findings today. A little bit about her, in case you are unaware. Susan Buck is an art conservator and a paint analyst. She employs analytical techniques originally developed for easel paintings for the study of paints and finishes on art objects and architectural materials. She has her PhD in art conservation research from the University of Delaware, and her dissertation was a study of the paints of the 1818 Aiken Red House and its outbuildings in Charleston, South Carolina. Dr. Buck has worked around the world, including in Beijing at the Forbidden City, but has found the complex paint evidence at the Cupola House to be as fascinating as any of her most challenging investigations, as she will illustrate in her lecture tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, art conservator and paint analyst, Dr. Susan Buck.
What an amazing opportunity to be here. I'm going to walk you through the paint findings in the house. Some of it's going to seem rather esoteric, maybe images you haven't seen before in terms of looking at houses, because not only are we looking at a house being deconstructed, but we're also looking at layers under the microscope. So it is like detective work and it's like archaeology, which I hope I can explain as we work our way through how we look at paint evidence in a house like the cupola house, which has retained virtually everything that it had since 1758. So sadly, you can see in this black and white image, the house was in very poor condition. If you look closely at the siding, there's almost nothing there. It looks like bare wood. Although perhaps there are areas underneath cornices and trim elements that might retain a little bit of exterior paint evidence, which is where I looked when I was looking carefully for clues to how the house had originally been painted. So my primary tool is a microscope that is typical of what you'd see in a hospital research lab. So I started off with the microscope that's on the left, that kind of cumbersome way of looking at cross sections and photographing them, and then taking these photographs and shuffling them around and trying to see how the layers line up. And you know, this is the way we all started in this field, but once digital imaging became available, it became clear that there's so many more accessible ways of not only photographing the samples, but also visually aligning the layers. And that's critical if you're looking at chronologies and you want to see how does one room relate to the other, or how does a piece that we've found out of context relate to where we think it might go. So I'm looking at cross sections, which are layers applied over time, and the substrate might be plaster or wood, but I'm also looking at pigments. So the first step is the cross sections. The second step is scrapings, tiny scrapings of individual paint layers to see what the pigments are. And so these pigments, some are very familiar to you, like Prussian blue and red ochre. Every pigment particle has its own set of optical properties, its shape, size, the way it refracts light, which makes it identifiable under the microscope using transmitted light. So the cross sections I look at in reflected light, the light comes down onto the sample and back through the oculars and the camera. And for the pigments and fibers, the light source is at the bottom and it sends light up through the sample. And this will all start to make sense to you once I walk you through these. So here's your first pigment sample. These are particles that are rich royal blue. They have kind of sharp edges. They're rather translucent, and they have a property when the polarized filters are crossed is they kind of disappear, right? So there is a property called isotropic, and it is something that we use to identify particular types of pigments. So this pigment is synthetic ultramarine, and it's not available until after 1830. And you will see why this is relevant as we get further into it. So I never saw any first floor paint evidence when I came to look at the second floor and the exterior. And the return of these rooms from the Brooklyn Museum is like this miracle, really. What an astounding opportunity, not only to put the woodwork back into its context, but also to understand how the first floor paints related to the second floor, and what Mr. Corbin was trying to say when someone entered their house and saw the choices he had made in terms of paint colors, paint surfaces, expensive paints, and it's all there. So I've worked on period rooms in other museums, and my big worry was that the Brooklyn Museum had stripped this woodwork. So I didn't know until I got into the warehouse and I saw, oh my gosh, it's all there. So they were very gentle. They simply probably cleaned the woodwork, which I'm sure was grimy, and then repainted it a number of times, and we'll explain how this all evolved. But here is one of the rooms, the Central Hall, in its context in the Brooklyn Museum. And you notice there are no ceiling medallions. So they left the ceiling medallions in place, but they took most of the first floor woodwork, except for parts of the stair. But you see, it's quite dark. So we can use black and white photographs as references, not for color, but for contrast between light walls and dark woodwork in this case. So room 101 is the label for this stair hall, center passage. Oops, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. So here we have the stair hall in its place now, and one of the doors that was returned from the Brooklyn Museum that had been in the stair hall. And it's now got this odd two-tone palette. So you kind of wonder, like, where did this come from? So in this case, I took multiple samples from different parts of the woodwork that was in the house. And at the very bottom, on top of the wood, you see a coarse, thickly applied red-brown paint. So that red-brown paint appears on virtually all the original elements. And so it's not a dramatic color, but it is very durable. So you have a space that's going to get a lot of abuse as people are walking through it and bringing objects through. It's very practical, but it would have made this stair hall pretty dark. But it's emphatically the first paint layer on all the woodwork in the first floor stair hall. But what about the stair elements that are original? And we have some interesting ghosts for example, where the original stair rail was abutted against the newel post. And so one of the questions was, at what point do these paint or varnish histories align? And so I was able to sample on the ghost and adjacent to it, but also to use what's on the newel post as a reference to the carved stair brackets. So in this case, what you've got is, it's hard to see because, you know, we're looking at very thin layers, but on the original elements, it's a red-brown stain. So it's applied thinly enough so that you can see the figure of the wood behind it, but it would have enhanced the wood. And in the reflected ultraviolet light photograph, you see fluorescent layers, 3 of them, whitish, with grime trapped between them. So it's stained deep red brown, probably to match the rest of the woodwork. And then over time, it's varnished 3 times, each time collecting a lot of dirt. So why is this significant? Number one, I think they're showing that these elements, which are made of different woods, were intentionally matched to each other. And it also allows us to look at these carved brackets and see, like, what are early, what might be slightly later. So these brackets, we're looking at 2 samples that are from 2 different, subtly different carved brackets. So one bracket, the one labeled 201-1, is slightly flatter, maybe not quite as precise, and the one labeled 201-2 has a slightly deeper carving. The flower form is a little bit more open. So in fact, the comparison suggests the original red-brown stain is in that bracket that you see that's 201-2. It's the one on the right, the 201-1, the one on the right-hand side. And then that second one, the slightly different bracket, doesn't have the stain, but it does have the varnish. So it's not the same period, but it still could be pretty early. So this is one way we're starting to understand, like, how does this staircase with its carvings come together? The other astonishing discovery happened the last time I was here, about 3 weeks ago. And honestly, I had been here in 2018 and I had not paid attention to the first floor ceiling medallions. I just figured they're treated like the plaster, that they are plaster. And in fact, once I got up there to take a sample, it was clear that they were carved wood, and that the carving of that central flower form matches carvings on other elements within the house. So it's a wooden carved medallion, both on the first floor and one on the second floor. I've honestly never seen that before. And it was painted the same deep red brown. So what you see in the cross-section is a kind of etched, scored, grimy surface of that red-brown paint. So it's exposed for decades before it's painted over. So people who saw the Corbin house before, I'm thinking before the woodwork gets removed, probably saw those brackets as looking like carved wood, and the white paint comes along a little later. So those of you who are up front can probably see the details of this image. This is the Brooklyn Museum. I think they're trying to, a new curator comes along and says, well, what do we do with this period room? It's kind of static. People aren't interested in period rooms anymore. And so in this case, I think they're interpreting the room as it was as an abandoned room, right? Animals have kind of pecked the painting, and there are ceramics on the floor, and there are bird droppings on the table, right? So I just think it tells you something about how curators are struggling to talk about period rooms within a museum context now. But what you do see is blue paint also. Now, there was work done in 1976-77 in the conservation department at the Brooklyn Museum. They, as far as we can tell, took 5 samples. One sample was sent to Frank Welsh, who's a noted architectural paint conservator, and he sent back a written 2-page report with no photomicrographs. And he actually understood what the original paint was in this space. So this is from the dining room. And that room is now interpreted as blue. And so what you're looking at in the cross-section is a white primer that has sunk into the wood, thinly applied, and the blue paint layer is on top of it, the finish coat, with a kind of fine layer of grime. So in this case, yes, we've got the evidence, which perhaps they did use to interpret this dining room, because it was blue, painted blue by the Brooklyn Museum. So here we've got the woodwork that is in the warehouse with a brilliant orange interior of the cupboard, and that's a pretty classic treatment, this kind of bright orange. But the cross-sections show, from both the backboards, the shelving, the upper and lower case, that the interior of the upper case, which would have been used to display your most precious objects, it was blue. It was blue on that off-white primer with a kind of glaze sitting on the surface. Then a long time later, it gets repainted a salmon color. So, but blue, which is the same as the blue on the woodwork, on the interior of this cupboard. And then the lower cupboard, more a functional space, is a red-brown similar to what you see in the stair hall. So that's probably used for storage, not display, but different from what we see now from the Brooklyn Museum. And I took multiple samples in different areas of woodwork to see, like, is this blue consistent on all the elements from the dining room? And yes, you see in this sample from the door that it's also blue. It's blue on a white primer with a glaze layer, so it was glossy. And when you look at these paints, which are made with Prussian blue, you see these dark blue particles widely distributed through the layer, some kind of clumped together. That's because Prussian blue is notoriously hard to mix. It tends to stick together. You need to really, really grind it to distribute it, but it makes the deepest, richest blue. And this is a kind of classic mid-18th century color. And in this case, the baseboards were dark brown. So trying to get a sense of how this room presented in its original form. Then we have the parlor. It was also painted blue by the Brooklyn Museum, but at some point early on, it's displayed in a kind of glossy brown varnish. So where do these come from, these colors? So in fact, there's evidence on one door that they were doing some scraping tests. There's a big gouge from probably a chisel that was most likely a sample. So perhaps one of the samples that was later photographed by the Brooklyn Museum in 2019, maybe that's there, from there, but we don't know because the documentation doesn't say where the samples have come from and where the interpretation came from. But you can see on the door in the scraping test, there is a blue layer that emerges. And this is one of those samples from 1977. And it shows a kind of whitish layer on the wood with cracks, and the kind of pinkish layer that shows up on top of it is like the 8th generation in the paint sequence, which I'll show you. So, and the blue layer on top is Brooklyn Museum. So how does this work out? And I hope you can see this. Yeah, the screen is a little bit lighter than the actual colors, but what you do is you look for the layers that are directly on top of the wood, and then a layer of grime or dirt that define the boundary. So the first layer is a thick off-white or cream-colored paint. It has a grime layer on its surface. The second generation is a darker cream color, also with a grime layer, and it doesn't get painted blue until its third generation. So yes, the blue is there, but it's not its original color. And this, again, I took samples from all different elements of the room. The same paint history shows up. This lighter cream color, darker cream color, and then the blue as the third generation. So we see that now in fragments that are emerging from the walls. Just one fragment today that I looked at has the same paint history that stops at generation 4. So that must be the time the room gets taken apart. The other thing that's happening as the rooms are being dismantled is that rat nests are coming out from between the joists, behind baseboards, clumps of plaster, some with colored coatings. So remember, we don't know anything about what the walls were. We can surmise, but there's no fibers trapped on the edge of door architraves that might suggest wallpaper. There are no paper fragments trapped in between paint layers. We just don't have that. But seeing some of these plaster fragments with a little bit of color on them was heartening. And let's see, can you see that? So what you're looking at are two cross sections of plaster. The plaster is that coarse sandy coating at the bottom. And then there are multiple unpigmented lime washes applied on top of the plaster. The boundaries are hard to see in this image, but they are quite defined, right? So in some cases, maybe, 14 generations of unpigmented lime wash, then a gray distemper. So distemper is found in dilute high glue, classic wall covering, wall paint, and used for wallpapers also. And then on top of that is green. So like, how can we interpret this green? It's coming later. I'll tell you once I talk to you about this adjacent room. So this is the rear room that originally had no fireplace mantle. And we know that for sure because when the fireplace mantle was brought back from Brooklyn, all of a sudden it was revealed that some of the original siding, rusticated siding, was used for the back of it to create this mantle. So that has to be a later element, and you can kind of faintly see the rusticated lines in the vertical. and there are little bits of paint trapped in those depressions, and it was a cream color that exactly matched the cream color I had found on the exterior of the house. So maybe that's only in place for one generation, or it weathers away to almost nothing, but there's a tiny bit of exterior paint still there. But there's not a lot of paint on the woodwork that's come out of this room. So it's a rear room, it's a secondary space, we don't know how it's used, but it's first the same light cream color as its adjacent space, the parlor, right? And we know that there's a connecting door between those rooms, which was confirmed just recently as part of the room dismantling. And the first layer is kind of eroded, but it's clearly matches the first paint in the parlor. But what's on top of it? It's kind of a yellowish green layer. Maybe this was the reference that the Brooklyn Museum used for their repainting, because the room space is now green. How can we understand what's happening? So the first yellowish green layer on the mantle has to date to its later installation. And it's important to do pigment ID here because the bright yellow pigment that's in this yellowish green paint is chrome yellow. So chrome yellow, well, it's available for artist pigments by about 1812, but my colleague Kirsten Travers Moffat has done a massive amount of research into chrome yellow, and her feeling is that for architectural paints, we're probably not seeing that till about 1825. So that green paint goes on the mantle about 1825, which tells us that room's not coming into its form until 1825. So we have that one rear room that's not getting repainted for, what, almost 70 years. So the reason we know it's chrome yellow is hard to tell from here, but chrome yellow, tiny, rounded, bright yellow pigments, interspersed are little yellow rods. So that's the physical property of chrome yellow, and it's important because it gives us a not before then date. And it is also a brilliant yellow. So here's some more of those plaster fragments. So we also have some fragments that are related to this rear space. Again, we have some blue colors, we have some greens. And here we have, again, long sequences of unpigmented lime washes. Simply slaked lime and water applied very thinly. I think you can make out the boundaries between the layers. And at the very top of the layer that had the green paint, we see a gray distemper and then a green distemper. So that actually has Prussian blue in it and a little bit of chrome yellow. So again, dating it to later. And then the blue distemper at the top of the other, I thought, wow, wouldn't this be great if this was a period color? But in fact, that blue distemper is made with synthetic ultramarine. So remember, synthetic ultramarine is after 1830. So these rooms must become more colorful after this period of reconstruction with the mantle installation. So we still don't know what the walls were, but I actually do think more is going to emerge as more spaces are deconstructed. Now we've got this great cupboard that, well, its back protruded into the rear northeast room. And it clearly has remnants of lime washes on it, but not much. So if you think this might have been a pantry, right, it makes sense that it was lime washed because lime washes are very alkaline. They're considered hygienic. Like lime washes were used for dairies and infirmaries and spaces for cooking and laundry. So they're very practical, inexpensive, they can be refreshed multiple times. In this case, we only have 2 layers of lime wash, but what's important about this is that we also have several partition wall boards that had been discovered when the parlor was being dismantled. And they seem to be related directly in terms of their line washes, their shape, their ghosts, to what had been the partition wall that divided the rear pantry space connecting to the back of the cupboard. So pretty exciting that all of a sudden we can reconstruct a space that's now has a modern bathroom and a modern kitchen. I think we're really starting to be much more confident about the interpretation of what that space was and how it looked. So I sampled the woodwork in that rear room, which we think had been the pantry. And it's not lime washed, this is a window architrave. So both window architraves in that back there are painted with a stable, well-made, oil-based, tannish yellow paint. And then some dirt collects and it cracks. It's repainted white. That white layer collects some dirt, another white layer, and then we get into the modern paints. There are about 18 paint generations in this back space, this modernized kitchen space. But the evidence still survives on these windows. And so one question had to be like, Andrew Owenby asked me, where did the partition wall butt up against the window? Was it actually touching the side of the architrave? Was that, it seemed to be maybe where its logical space was. And in fact, a sample taken from the side of the architrave showed the yellow paint, tannish yellow paint was there, but then it was missing 4 generations of paint. So my hypothesis is the woodwork gets painted tannish yellow, then this cupboard gets whitewashed at the same time as this partition wall is installed. I think probably pretty soon within the completion of this space, but we've now got this evidence that tells us much more about what this looked like and its kind of practical appearance and its relative expense, because these yellow ochre pigments were quite cheap. So I also want to talk a bit about the second floor because I had done this earlier analysis, but it all fits into the story of what this house was when it was first created. And I had sampled woodwork on the second floor, and what we found is the center passage here is kind of a grayish color. Again, pretty practical for a space that's going to have a lot of people walking through it, objects being bashed into the woodwork, but a little bit more private than the first floor hall. So it's a kind of practical gray. And you can see those are all the later paints that still survive. But then how about this primary chamber, the southeast chamber, now painted a kind of gold color? Well, it was brilliant green. It was brilliant green with this pigment called verdigris, copper carbonate, that was the brightest green in the 18th century. But it's basically, if you think about how copper corrodes, it has a big blue-green corrosion product that is harvested, washed, ground, that becomes the pigment for verdigris paints. And there's yellow ochre with this mix, which makes it more of a brilliant green. But look at the size of that verdigris particle. It's giant. So that's classic 18th century hand-ground paint. The pigments are kind of unevenly distributed, they're grainy, this is a tough paint to make. I've made it myself, and it's a struggle to get the pigments to disperse. But if you wanted a brilliant green, this is what you used before chrome green became available about 1825. So this paint was brilliant green, it was grainy, it was thick, and it was also glossy. So that chamber must have just knocked your socks off. You walked in from the center passage, which was gray, you open the door, it's glossy, brilliant, grainy green. And then we have the opposite chamber, so this would be the southwest first floor, now painted this kind of yellowish green color. Not sure when this research is done, but again, it's important to recheck these with newer approaches. And what you see here is that the first layer on the woodwork is actually tan, and that yellow-green paint is the second generation. Hope you can see that, especially on the left-hand cross-section. And again, for that pigment composition, that yellow-green paint has chrome yellow, right? So it has to be after about 1825. Then I took a few samples when I was doing this project in the two rear spaces. So the rear northeast chamber, I think it was a chamber, was a kind of gray-blue color, and the rear northwest chamber was an off-white. So what you're seeing is almost every room is a different color in the first period. We don't know why. People don't write about color in the period, except for Washington complained about the quality of his painter's Prussian blue, but most people don't write about paints or pigments. So the next step is, how do we match the color? So I have a colorimeter microscope that allows me to look and measure the color of a sample as small as 0.3 millimeters. And we use both the standard Munsell color system and the LAB color space, which is, if you think of color as a round circle, it's a continuum. So it plots the color. And then you kind of go from those numeric numbers to a commercial paint so people can visualize what these colors look like. So here we have, someone's attempt to colorize the house from a black and white image. But at this point, we can plot some colors based on this analysis and show them within their context. So for the first floor woodwork, again, this is approximate. You're looking at a captured digital image in a digital format on a screen with a PowerPoint canvas, but this gives you an idea of the variations. So in the first period, your primary entertaining room is this rich, beautiful blue with a kind of graininess and brush marks. The central stairwell is the kind of practical red-brown, and the rooms to the left-hand side, that rear room, which we're still kind of trying to understand, and its connecting parlor were both light cream color. Quite an elegant approach to an entertaining room. And then that rear room on the northeast side is a practical yellow with whitewashed partition space. On the second floor, you have a real statement of color with that verdigris-based parlor. Imagine walking into that room. Anyone who is visiting Corbin will know he has spent a lot of money on a space in the second floor. Because not only do you have to pay for these verdigris pigments, you have to have a very good painter who knows how to mix these irregular pigment particles, brush them out smoothly, create a glaze. This was, a real statement of style and taste. And opposite is that tannish room, a more practical, subdued space. Behind it, a cream color, and that far rear room on the northeast side is a practical gray. It's like every room's a different color, and why? We wish people wrote about color applications, but so what we have to do is kind of take a leap from the physical evidence to think about how this house is being used. So it's possible to use all this evidence from paint analysis for making choices about repainting, but commercial paints are not like 18th century hand-ground paints. So I've done this with many projects. Sometimes people think they might want to use hand-ground paints, and they eventually back off because it's cumbersome or expensive. Or sometimes it's important to just hand grind the paints to see what a freshly made paint looks like when you know its composition. And you're looking at my friend Bob Self, who was the conservator at Monticello, and we worked together to hand grind a chrome yellow base paint for the Monticello dining room. So the big question about Monticello was, right, it shows up clearly in the cross sections, a chrome yellow base paint. Jefferson dies in 1826. We have records of chrome yellow being used in 1812 in Baltimore on fancy painted furniture. And Jefferson is, if anything else, he's intent on establishing his own style. So I think all the curators felt confident, yeah, this is a Jefferson statement. So we hand ground the chrome yellow to really understand its brilliance. I've also worked on mock-ups for pigmented lime washes, but a number of sites have taken that step, either doing replicas and mock-ups to show what the paint looked like, or actually having the paints made by several colleagues who do beautiful paint making, and bringing them to the site and applying these paints with 18th century round brushes as close as they could be to what they were when they were first created. So what's left? I'm hoping more plaster fragments emerge. I have a few new samples which I took today, which I need to put into context. I'm thinking to understand those ceiling medallions and their carvings, we need to do some very careful selective overpaint removal to show the detail of the carving and also reveal that original red-brown paint. So that's kind of time consuming, but it's not an unusual step to take. And then we need to refine the color matches, and we need to discuss the philosophy of reinterpreting these spaces. Like, what are you gonna do with the parlor and the rear northwest room, which are both cream color in the first period, but they don't match after that, and the cream color goes on to woodwork that doesn't represent the room as we see it now with a mantle, right? So that space takes its form after 1825 when it's painted kind of lime greenish color. So many, many people to thank for this project, because all this work doesn't take place in a vacuum. I work with teams of very skilled historians, craftspeople, preservationists, curators, and so we're still working on trying to understand this house and how best to talk to the public about it. So, but it's an exciting journey, and it's not quite done. So thank you.
Too soon, but regarding the medallions on the ceiling, so regarding the wooden medallions on the ceiling, do we have any other houses that anyone can think of that may have the same trait, like to kind of pick up the seriation or regional?
It's such a good question, because honestly, I have been asking my colleagues, and everybody who's on this team has started reaching out to other historic sites. No one has seen this. So these are generally cast plaster ceiling medallions. This seems to be, as far as I know, unique to the Cupola house. So it's extraordinary.
Other questions?
You can catch me afterwards when we're having something at refreshments. So thanks so much.
On behalf of the Cupola House Association, we'd like to thank you for your presentation today. Of course, green. We also would like to encourage everyone, if you were not already a member, there's so many fascinating and exciting things that are happening at the Cupola House, so we do ask that perhaps you consider joining the Cupola House Association. We also would like to recognize we have a whole group of Clemson University students here, so we want to thank you all also for being here and for sharing your interest in our Cupola House. And you are all invited to our reception afterwards. We'll have little tidbits for you to enjoy and some wine. And again, thank you for being part of our third speaker series. And we look forward to seeing you May 6th for our final speaker series event. And it is uncovering more mysteries at the Corbin Cupola House. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.